Welcome this evening to the latest in our series of nominally London lectures for the Royal Institute of Philosophy, now of course taking place globally across the world. Our theme for this series has been called a Philosophers Manifesto. We've been asking people to present their ideas for practical changes of either policy or law, and to give the intellectual philosophical case for them. But it's also been a fundamental principle of this series that we're reaching more broadly than perhaps those who would be narrowly defined as philosophers these days. Philosophy has historically always been a subject in dialogue with adjacent disciplines, and for that reason we've invited certain people who do not sit in departments of philosophy to bring in their expertise. And one such person is speaking this evening, the wonderful Diane Coyle, Professor Diane Coyle. She's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Has been a government advisor on economic policy, including throughout this current pandemic. Her latest book is Market, State and People, Economics for Public Policy, and it examines how societies reach decisions about the use and allocation of economic resources. She's been awarded a CBE for her contribution to the public understanding of economics, and that was in 2018. We're soon going to hear the talk. I should just say these talks happen regularly throughout the winter. We also have other events, annual debates, lectures, other parts of the country. We have a YouTube channel which you can subscribe to and follow, and also a Facebook page where you'll have all the details of the upcoming events, as well as our own website, royalinstitutephilosophy.org. So what's going to happen is we're going to hear Diane's talk, and it's a fascinating one, a very timely one. Hardly a day goes by, it seems, without something in the news about people saying, well, we must do something about controlling the big tech companies. And there's a lot of dispute about how we do it. And her approach, I think, is an interesting, fresh, original, and provocative one. We'll hear the talk, and then we'll take questions from myself, of course. I will abuse my privilege as chair. But to help me not to abuse it too much, please do submit your own questions in the chat boxes, whether you're watching it on Facebook or on YouTube. So first of all, let's hear Diane's talk.
My subject is what's gone wrong with the digital world and what to do about it. And I've got one proposal, the public option. Yesterday, I had a spam email inviting me to join the Illuminati. It said it was a special offer for 1 month only, and only to apply if I was really serious. So this is a small and silly example of the kind of conspiracy theories that are rife on the internet. We have a toxic online environment. Some of the conspiracy theories are potentially fatal, anti-vax conspiracies. And then there's the violence that's being incited in some places, the potential for elections to be distorted, the trolling that goes on every day, particularly of women online, the misinformation, the child pornography, the fraud. Something has gone terribly wrong. And this matters because, as this chart shows, we are spending an awful lot of time online. By last year, we were spending 28 hours a week online. That's more than one day. That's more than 24 hours out of every week. And you can see it's been going up ever since around 2008. That was when we had the combination of smartphones arriving, 3G access so that we could always be on, and the kind of market design that economists devised around that time to create all the apps that made our smartphones so compelling. So within the past 20 years, we've gone from 0 to about 1/7 of our waking and sleeping lives online, or about 1/5 of our waking hours, 1/5 of our waking hours online. The problem isn't being online in itself. Here's another chart. I'm an economist, so I like charts. This one shows us that we are spending an awful lot of our online time on Google and Facebook. There are others that feature there, of course: Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Twitter, Spotify, also ByteDance and eBay. And if you look closely, you can see a couple of serious news sites, the BBC and Sky. But Google and Facebook between them are approaching half a day in our lives every week. So they're the problem. Do they need fixing? Google famously started out with a corporate slogan, "Don't be evil." And it's one that's been gradually downplayed in its corporate communications. So the temptation is to say, well, it's a question of ethics. They have become unethical companies, and there is now a very large academic industry thinking about digital ethics, and particularly with regard to AI, the emerging technology using all the data that's being accumulated by tech companies. And I think people are probably becoming quite familiar with that. The search autocompletes that reveal terrible biases, or the data bias that comes from machine learning systems being trained on biased data and reinforcing a biased world. And it has to be said, Google isn't helping itself. It's been firing its internal ethics researchers. Recently, Dr. Timnit Gebru, and just very recently, Meg Mitchell. But of course, the companies also have codes of conduct, content moderation. Facebook's appointed its oversight board. And so they're not unaware of these ethical concerns being raised about their behavior. But I don't think they're evil people, and most of their employees certainly are not. That's conspiracy thinking too, in my book. The issue for me isn't their ethics, it's their business model. I searched recently for walking shoes, wanted to buy a new pair. And the first screen that Google returned to me was all advertising. So my next chart on this slide, and I told you I like charts, it shows you the share of Google's revenues that come from advertising. 83% come from advertising. Google isn't a search company, it's an advertising company. It's degrading its own product by showing only adverts in the top page of search results because we all think we're using it to find out useful information. But Google and Facebook between them account for 2/3 of the online advertising market, according to our Competition and Markets Authority. And it's this business model that I think is at the heart of the problem. It's manipulating us into buying products from advertisers who pay the most money to be made most prominent on these platforms. Now, the advertising industry's been around for an awful long time, of course, and it dates back to the behaviorism of B.F. Skinner and the technique known as operant conditioning, reinforcing people's behavior by giving them positive stimuli, tried first on pigeons and rats, but increasingly on human subjects, and ever since the era of Madison Avenue that was glorified in Mad Men, in the advertising industry too. The ad industry is founded on behaviorism. Now, adverts can give us information, and a lot of the conventional economic theorizing about the advertising industry is that it's about information provision. This is true to some degree. If there's a new product, a new invention like the smartphone, then that's the way we have to find out about it. The inventors have to market it to us. And that's been true dating back to Victorian times. And of course, there's been hype that's at least as old as the Victorian advertising industry itself. The claims that were made for patent medicines or clever devices were no different really from the claims made about gadgets and products now. But it's increased in scale. And we've been known for a long time that it's not just about information, that it's about manipulation too, getting us to buy all those things we didn't know we wanted and perhaps don't want. So here's a quotation from the economist Nicholas Kaldor in 1950. Advertising is mainly a device for strengthening monopoly power and weakening competition, and is therefore antisocial in its effects. What did he mean? He meant that companies with more money can buy more adverts, they can buy more shelf space, and that brings them more revenues, and so they're more able to advertise. And so there's a circle, a virtuous circle or a vicious circle, depending which way you look at it, whereby the most powerful companies increase the amount of business for themselves, increase their revenues, increase their advertising, increase the amount of business that they get. And they do this through differentiating their products too. So if you go to a supermarket and you see what looks like a huge range of different washing powders or breakfast cereals, many of them will turn out to be owned by the same company, which is buying itself even more shelf space by differentiating its products in this way. And so the scale of this advertising was ratcheted up by the Mad Men era and TV advertising on top of print, and it's been ratcheted up again in the digital era, and it fills our lives. We're spending all that time on Google and Facebook are advertising companies. They have monopoly power too, and I'm going to inflict a bit of economics on you and tell you why digital markets are distinctive and have these characteristics that mean they tend to have only one or two companies dominant in them. Winner-take-all characteristics in the jargon of economics. So the first thing is that they have increasing returns to scale. To establish a company of this kind, to create a search engine or a platform, a social media platform, takes a lot of investment. Some of it's investment in machinery, but a lot of it is investment in designing the software. And almost all of the cost of that is an upfront cost. So it's very expensive to set up. And then once you have that company in place, that platform in place, the more that you can sell, the cheaper it will be for every new customer that you add. And these economies of scale are extremely large because at the margin, when you add one new person onto Facebook or onto using Google search, the cost to the company itself is zero. And these increasing returns, they are known in other industries, but they're extremely large and everywhere in the digital economy. A second effect is what we call network effects that reinforces the importance of scale. And that says that the more users there are on a digital platform, the better it is for everybody else. And it doesn't matter which side of the platform they're on, whether they are advertisers on one side or consumers on the other side, because for each side of that platform, the more people there are able to buy, or the more advertisers there are offering products, the better it is for everybody. Or just think about the social network. The more of your friends join, the better it is for you, and vice versa. And these network effects are very powerful. They augment the increasing returns to scale. And they mean that it's very hard for consumers to switch away. Once you're tied in that way, it's unless everybody else that you know is going to switch too, then you're sort of stuck with it. And the companies augment that by bundling lots of different products together. And hence we have, as well as Google Search, Gmail, Google Docs, Google Scholar if you're an academic, all of those things tied together become very compelling. It's why some of the antitrust cases brought against the big companies have focused so much on this bundling. You might remember the case the European Commission took against Microsoft's Internet Explorer and the bundling of that. And the same is true now with mobile operating systems and the way that they have so much bundled in them on the smartphone screen. So that's two reasons why there are winner-take-all effects in digital markets. A third is about data, the data loop. And we're all now aware that the companies are creating large databases that track a lot of what we do, our characteristics, our tastes, what we purchase, where we go. They combine all of that data and they use it to sell advertising. They can get higher advertising fees the more that advertisers think they can target the kind of consumers who are more likely to buy their products. If you can sell more advertising through targeting that way and it's effective or thought to be effective, then you get more revenues. You can use those revenues then to improve the services that you give to consumers and also to sell more advertising, to do the targeting better, to improve your algorithms. And so just as advertising in itself creates a feedback loop for big companies, targeting advertising using the data reinforces that feedback loop. And the big tech companies have so much more data than anybody else, and they make it so much harder for new companies to get into the market. And then finally, there's human behavior, the human brain, how we think about things and make choices. And there are a lot of things that tie us into the companies that we already use, as well as the bundling of different services. There are things like all of the content that we provide if it's a social media platform. Do we really want to risk losing the photos as well as the connections? And the ratings that people acquire, if they're suppliers on the platform, if you're selling through Amazon Marketplace or through Facebook, you don't really want to lose the reputation that you build up there. These things together make it very difficult for the market power of the big tech companies to be dislodged. People sometimes describe this as surveillance capitalism. And in my mind, if it's not being done by the state for political or ideological reasons, it's not really surveillance. They don't care about you. They care about your money and how you're going to spend the money. And what's at the heart of all of this is the drive for clicks. It's all about the advertising business model. The companies want you to click on things because that's what allows them to sell their main product, which is advertising space, to advertisers. And that drive for clicks, whatever it takes, is what's creating all of the toxins that are spilling over into every other company online. And we have somehow ended up in a position where the advertising model is really the only model, the only business model that people think about on the internet. That, for me, is the problem. Advertising is a problem anyway. It doesn't give us information. It reinforces corporate power. And we have put that on steroids in the digital world. So what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of activity in the exciting world of competition policy, which is one of the things that I do. And in our jargon, we talk about competing for the market rather than in the market. The returns to scale and the network effects mean that it's always likely that digital companies will be winner-take-all companies, that there'll be only one or two operating in different segments of the market. And actually, that's a lot of what makes them valuable. Because if I'm on a social media platform, I want my friends and family and work colleagues to be on there too. So breaking up isn't how we typically think about dealing with these companies. It's about how do we make it possible for new and better companies to take us away and switch to them. So if Google and Facebook are degrading their offer by showing us only advertising that isn't really what we want to find out, can we switch to somebody better? Just as back in the old days, if you're old enough to remember it, people switched from Yahoo to Google because Google search was so much better. So can that market entry, that innovation, be made possible in these markets? And there are lots of proposals around. One of them that I like a lot is to make sure that the data that companies are accumulating about us is accessible to new entrants to the market. So that just as we now have an open banking system where the banks, if their customers agree, have to make available through what's called an API, an application programming interface, that data to new entrants into financial services, you could do the same in other kinds of markets too. So that's one possibility. The Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK is setting up a digital markets unit which will devise a code of conduct so that the behaviour of these big companies who are designated of interest is improved, so that they don't give us terms and conditions that we can't possibly understand, so that they don't change the conditions under which developers can access their platforms without consulting with them, and so on. So that would be good. We could tax them. And there's a lot of discussion in policy circles about how to extract some tax revenues from overseas-based companies that don't actually pay very much. We could break them up, or at least we could stop them acquiring new companies. Between them, Google and Facebook have made more than 400 acquisitions in the past 10 years, and they weren't doing all of that to, out of the goodness of their heart, to serve customers better. Some of that was about acquiring the talent. Some of it was about acquiring clever software that they could improve themselves. Some of it was about stopping competitors getting into the market. And with hindsight, it was probably a mistake to let all of those go ahead. So those are all good things to think about and do. I'm in favour of all of them. But my real proposal is that we tackle the core problem, and that's the business model. And I want to suggest that we create a competing business model, and that's inspired by the example of broadcasting and public service broadcasting. Here is Dame Nellie Melba singing into this newfangled radio broadcasting equipment back in 1922. This New Noise, it was called. This was the digital technology of its day, the high-tech frontier that was massively hyped. And in the United Kingdom, we did something really clever and created an organisation British Broadcasting Company, later the British Broadcasting Corporation, as a deliberate industrial policy. It was intended to make sure that this country had a stake in this new high-tech industry, that we knew how to benefit from it, that we had products and services that would serve the people of this country with British-made programs, but also British-made radios, and ensure that we were at the forefront of this exciting new technology. So it was a deliberate policy on the part of the government of the day. It ensured that there was not competing turf wars over access to radio spectrum, so that was managed by the Post Office, and it was also paternalistic. The grandees, the elite, the experts of the day were worried about the possible effects of this newfangled radio content on audiences who were unused to it. There was a kind of moral panic about it too. And this is something that's very familiar to us from the digital era also. So we now have, and have had since the 1920s, the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's one of the most trusted news providers in the world. It, for all its flaws, battles to be impartial and accurate, and flies the flag against fake news. It has a Royal Charter. Here's the 2007 Royal Charter. This sets out its public service aims. It has to deliver on these and is held to account for its delivery. It has a commitment in the Charter to accurate and impartial news. It has an accountability structure. Importantly, it's independent from politics, but it's also independent from commercial incentives. And that means its business model is completely different. And I think this has changed the nature of competition in broadcasting for the better, because it means that competition isn't about numbers purely, it's about quality. There's a competition on quality and competition on the range of programs provided as well. And so in the BBC, we have an organisation that creates incentives for commercial public service broadcasters to deliver high quality programs, to deliver a variety of programs. It provides training for the rest of the industry. It has a fantastic research and development arm that helps ensure that Britain has stayed at the forefront of broadcasting technology for a century. We're really good at it. It's a fantastically successful export sector. Our writers, our directors, our special effects people, our musicians export all over the world, and people come to Britain to film their programs too. So we're a leading player in this business because of that government decision in 1922. This is my model for what we ought to be doing online. There's another debate about whether or not bashing the BBC is a good idea. I think at this moment of fake news and online toxicity, it's an entirely mad idea. But I want to argue for creating a sister organisation, a public service digital entity that would create a social media space or a search space which would restore competition on other dimensions apart from the hunt for clicks and apart from the hunt for advertising dollars. We'd still have to pay, and we'd have to pay whether or not we carried on using Google and Facebook or all of the other offerings out there. But then we pay already. We pay with our time. I talked about that earlier, how much time we're spending on Google and Facebook. But we also pay, on average, £500 a year each through digital advertising and higher product prices, according to the Competition and Markets Authority. And we would find it much easier as a society to avoid these social harms of conspiracy theories, of poisoned political debate, of polarisation, if there was a public option. So having a public option will be cheap by comparison and absolutely invaluable in reclaiming a space online for reasoned public debate. And that's what we need.
Thanks very much, Diane. There's so much in there. I certainly could have a half an hour, 45-minute just conversation with you about many things there. But I do want to give the opportunity for audience to ask questions. please put them in the chat below or to the right, whatever the interface is. We know you're out there. Please don't be shy. But let's go crack off with a few things. And as you say, I mean, Diane, you said beforehand to me, you're not a philosopher, but we're interested. Philosophers, people who are philosophically interested, are interested, I hope, or they should be, in how economists make sense of problems that they too see as problems. And, philosophers are interested in these ethical issues around monopoly control and so forth. Now, going back to a key point you said earlier on, which is you thought the problem was not with their ethics, but with the business model. And I'm wondering, would you say something about what may be a naive perception I have, which is that in terms of economics, I suppose one imagines there's one of the characteristic distinctions between, if you like, right wing and left wing, to use those increasingly old-fashioned terms, is that the right tends to see morality as a matter of personal agency and also of corporate agency. And the left seems to see morality as really more to do with the structures of society. That in the sense, individual agency is either impotent or irrelevant if the structures of society are kind of wrong. And I sometimes wonder whether or not those kind of moral principles are actually often driving the theory. Actually, that those people who emphasize and want to believe in individual agency above all will sort of create the economics that fits that, and vice versa. So I know there's a lot there, but I'm just interested in, as someone coming from an economics background, is that little sketch I've just presented at all accurate? And if so, if not, why not? And if so, what do you make of it?
Gosh, that's quite a big question. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who's decided that this is the best way to start their weekend. Thank you very much. Economists do have an underlying ethical philosophy, and it's old-fashioned utilitarianism. And so our models say people maximize their utility as individuals. So it's an individualist kind of philosophy. And this could be their profit if they're a company. It's often thought about as their income and expenditure if they're an individual. But you compile all kinds of things into a utility function. So you could argue that people are individually motivated by altruism, so that will be part of their utility function that you want to maximize. So that's the way that we economists get flexibility into it. But there's something very odd going on at the moment, and particularly around online debates, in what you presented as a left-right split. So, for example, one of the arguments people on the left make about big digital companies is that they're making all of this money from harvesting and collecting our data. They should pay some of that back to us. It's called data as labor. And the idea is that we're giving time. We should be paid for that by a small micro payment every time Facebook tracks us across the internet. And that strikes me as a very individualist answer, because a lot of the value that Google and Facebook get from the data that they gather is from aggregating it. And they want to know what people like me will shop for so that they can sell the advertising to people who want to sell products. And they need a pattern, and they get that from the aggregate of the data. There are online calculators where you can work out what your personal data is worth. And I did mine once, and it was something like 26 pence a year. So the individual data is not worth very much, and an individual solution doesn't really address that imbalance of economic power that I was talking about. So that's one example of individualism. Actually, universal basic income, another argument made by many on the left, is also very individualistic, it strikes me. Obviously, there's merit in arguing that we should move away from means testing and have that social pooling of risk that was the classic origin of the welfare state. But to say, if I'm given a universal basic income that solves all my problems, that seems to me to miss all of the social dimensions of it. I can't buy a good education system or health system. I can't buy public transport with a universal basic income. And so this curse of individualism actually seems to me to spread across the left-right domain. And thinking about the data economy, is really bringing it to the fore, because I think that you have to think about that as relational. Almost every bit of data is about myself in relation to somebody else, or a population average. It's all about pooling the information to get the value out of it.
There's, again, lots of interesting stuff coming out of that, and I was really struck by your use of the term relational towards the end. Interestingly enough, this is also the key term in Carlo Rovelli's interpretation of quantum physics. It's mostly ridiculous to make the comparison. Relationality is also, I happen to know, a key concept in sort of lots of non-Western philosophies, and it seems that in very, what I'm suggesting is there are various different domains of knowledge and understanding where perhaps there's been a rather individualistic focus, and people are waking up to perhaps the importance of those relational aspects. But let me just ask a bit more about this idea of resolving the ethics by sorting out the social architecture, because I think there's still quite a lot more to say. So first of all, the thing about, you said economists are essentially kind of utilitarians. I just want to get sure I've got you right on this. The key point there is, though, that that's not the same as saying they are economic self-maximizers, right? Which is the view which I think is becoming increasingly debunked. Am I right to say that that's not quite, because you said utilitarians may have preferences other than economic self-maximization. Do you think that's been a recent change or in thinking, and has it how big a change has it been?
It's the way that economists get around the charge of individualism and the observation that people are not actually totally selfish in real life. So it's an attempt to fit the theory to the empirical observation about how people behave. In general, though, I think economics is very individualistic, and it is about maximizing individual utility. So all of the workhorse models, analyses that we do would start with that. I'm going to, maximize my own benefit from the things that I personally care about. And you do find altruism stuck in there. But then we get into all kinds of problems about how do you add up different people's utility to get some kind of social total, because particularly in areas of public policy, because governments have to make decisions to spend or not to spend, choosing to favour one group over another group. And so we're in the business, as applied economists, advising governments of trying to think about how to add that up. And I'm sure people will have heard of Ken Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says that some assumptions that you would think were pretty banal really imply that it's impossible to come up with a social aggregate, which is really saying there are distributional conflicts, that favouring the interests of some people, the utility or the profits of some people, will harm other people. And so we don't have a good approach to making social decisions, despite all of the machinery around utility maximization that we bring to it.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to another. By the way, please do ask questions online. It's quite a reticent audience this evening, despite the fact that we know you're there. But you said that digital markets have these winner-takes-all characteristics, and that so therefore the effect is that people are competing for the market rather than in the market. Now, of course, a lot of people are very critical of capitalism in and of itself, and would say that this is simply an inherent problem of capitalism, and that therefore, if you want to solve this problem, you have to get rid of capitalism. What do you make of that?
It's a bit unclear to me these days what getting rid of capitalism means. There are also many varieties of capitalism, and most economies in the world could be described as capitalist in some way. And I do think it's human nature to want to exchange, to progress the division of labour and benefit from the expertise and the skills that mean that the pie can grow. That then becomes easier to distribute as it gets larger. I think of markets as social institutions themselves, and yet in the past generation or two, a kind of abstract idea of the free market has taken hold. That's dominated political philosophy, particularly in the US and UK, but spreading elsewhere. the Milton Friedman idea that the business of business is to make a profit and nothing else, and the idea of self-interested behaviour being the only watchword for everything that will generate societal benefits rather than individual benefits, that the market delivers the best social outcomes. We've had a very extreme version of it here in the UK as well. I would say even in the United States, it's not been quite so extreme. So I find it a really abstract sort of argument to say it's all the fault of capitalism. And I would think about it in terms of what's the structure of the markets? What are the incentives that people are facing? And that's why I said in the talk that I don't think that everybody working at Google and Facebook is evil by any means. It's about the incentives that have been created, partly by them, but also because of the US environment in which they operated, and the accidents of history, the early idea that the digital economy shouldn't be restricted at all with taxes or regulations because it was going to grow and the economy and everybody else would benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned again the idea that you're not doubting the sort of intentions of people at Google and so forth. I mean, is it just the empirical understanding of how the economy works that leads you to, and correct me if this is wrong conception, have a sort of somewhat, can we say, perhaps pessimistic view of how much individual agency can really have an impact on the big ethical issues of the day? I mean, would you say you do have a somewhat pessimistic view of how much individual agency can really contribute to this?
I suppose I do, in a sense. And we live in very complex societies, and there are a lot of competing interests. And so, if you want to change anything, I mean, suppose we wanted to change the incentives that Google and Facebook face, apart from the fact that we're not in the United States and they're American companies, then one person, whether working for those companies or not, can't simply change the way they operate in the business model. So a lot of the challenge in modern societies, it seems to me, is about getting people to coordinate. That doesn't mean there's no role for individuals, obviously, because you do get social movements generated by individual changes of behaviour, and particularly when there are charismatic individuals who change the public narrative. And social norms can then change quite quickly. And there are loads of examples of that. The speed with which people stopped thinking it was acceptable to smoke socially would be one example, or the speed with which acceptance of gay marriage spread in Western societies would be another example. So some social norms change really very slowly indeed, and others can change very quickly. And in those cases, I think certain individuals make a big difference, and lots of individuals acting in the same way, in an aligned way, change the social norms of behaviour very quickly. And a lot of the change in the way companies behave is about their social norms as well. And if you think about how quickly executive pay relative to the median in the organisation took off in the 1980s, that was a shift in social norm. There were separate canteens for the boss classes in the 60s and 70s, but they would never have thought of paying themselves 400 or 500 times what a typical worker in their company got paid. And that was a shift in this kind of social norm. So in a space of 5 or 10 years, I think those can shift, and individual agency is therefore very important.
Steve Pearson is in the audience, and he sort of is generally rather persuaded by your solutions. But he says his greatest concern is still the believing and sharing of false information. And I wonder if you might sort of say a bit more about how much you think what you propose could really have an effect on that. I mean, after all, if you talk about broadcast media, I mean, in broadcast media we have things like Fox News and everything, which I would go on the record as saying I don't think is a very reliable source, and perhaps has spread some false information. So one can agree that this is a good idea, but realistically, how far is it going to go to really address this problem of just false and incorrect information being spread?
I never think silver bullets work, so no single solution is going to be the answer here. And we not only have in broadcasting the BBC, we have a framework for commercial public service broadcasters and a very effective regulatory apparatus around broadcasting. And so we have seen Ofcom, the regulator, taking programs and channels off air if they don't abide by their standards. The United States used to have that too, and abolished it and created space for Fox News and shock jocks and so on. And so inserting there even a better funded NPR or public service broadcaster, I think, would make no difference now. And there's a real question, I think, about how to claw back from where we've got to. I'm certainly not claiming it's easy, but I do think it would help to have that actual statement of political intent to create something of this kind and say, enough with the fake news. We're not going to have that kind of environment for our public space.
I mean, is there any evidence, do you know, for example, that in countries where there is a greater regulation of state media and so forth, that does result in the public having a more accurate understanding? Is there any correlation, in other words, between how much of a free-for-all news is and how accurate the public's understanding is? Maybe there is no reliable evidence of that. I don't know.
There's certainly evidence that Fox News has contributed to political polarization in the United States and to extreme views about issues such as immigration. So that's there. I don't know of some great global overview of looking at different regulatory systems. No, it's a good question.
But it does follow up, actually. Fabio from the audience has come up with this question about whether companies are actually just creating social conflict for profit. And I suppose another question there would be, if they are, is that reason enough to do something about it, or is that their prerogative? Is it part of our free rights to make profit however we can, as long as it doesn't lead to death or illness? Do you think actually creating? Go on. So his question is simply: are companies creating social conflict for profit? Is conflict, in a sense, part of the mechanism by which they generate their profit?
I don't think conflict is the aim, but I think the answer to the question is yes, that they are generating extreme views and fake news types of views and conspiracy theories for profit, because those are the things that drive the clicks. And there is this snowball dynamic that once something starts to take off, it gets an accelerating traction and people click more, and that's more profit. But we are certainly seeing governments starting to do something about it, much too late, in my view. There was a point, I think, way back in the early days of the internet, in the mid to late 1990s, when it could have been decided that online companies were publishers. And so in this country, they would have been liable for defamation and so on in the same way that broadcasters are. And at that stage, the decision was taken not to do it. And now it's got to a scale that's really difficult to control. So I certainly don't want to give the impression I think there are easy answers to this. But we're seeing governments around the world starting to demand more in terms of taking down dangerous content. We've seen it recently with anti-vax campaigns. But these phenomena of fake news, misinformation, conspiracy theories are absolutely pernicious. They really are toxic. And I don't think what's being done at the moment is fast enough or intrusive enough on the operation of the companies.
Can I ask you a question, a more general one, about how economists justify, as it were, or what their thought is? I mean, there are lots of economic activities which I think a lot of people would think have bad effects. Now, I know that there's this idea of an externality in economics, which means that if one of those bad effects kind of basically can be costed in some way, such as it's creating pollution which someone else has to clear up, or it's reducing life, then mainstream economics can turn around and say, well, that's fine. Yeah, okay. So it's causing a bad effect. That should be charged for. Tax and regulation can be used to justify regulating it. But in some of these effects that these companies are having on society don't seem to fit that pattern so straightforwardly. The kind of harms they're causing are things that a lot of people perceive as harms, would judge to be harms. They're not the kind of things you could easily put a kind of dollar value on. So, as an economist, how do you justify regulation for a harm which doesn't carry any particular social cost? It's just something that we don't like.
Part of the answer is that the idea that economic efficiency should rule decisions has gone too far. The number of economists advising government has increased steadily over the post-war period. It's the most influential social science in government. And so lots of decisions get taken using the criteria of economics and economic efficiency to decide whether something is a good idea or not. And yet sometimes I think it's perfectly valid for societies to decide that economic efficiency should not be the decisive factor. One example that I've looked at is cost-benefit analysis, which has for some years now been widely used in UK government to decide what to invest in. And it's always looking more efficient to invest in public transport schemes like train lines in and around the southeast, because people there are more productive, land values are higher, you get a higher return if you improve the transport system there. So there's an economic logic to that, and that means that we have ended up with a very dense, rapid, reliable, believe it or not, public transport system feeding into London, and really pretty rubbish public transport systems across the northern cities or in the devolved nations. So sometimes you just want to override the economic criteria, and other things, other values might be more important than economic efficiency. I say this with some hesitation because I think the kind of value for money criterion is really important. We don't want to be wasting people's money. And there are plenty of governments which build white elephant presidential palaces and so on, and it should be using cost-benefit analysis. So I think that's part of the answer. I also think the other part is that the digital economy is changing the way we need to think about that, because it's all externalities. Those phenomena, those characteristics that I talked about earlier, mean that there's so much influence of one person's decision on another person, that to think about externalities as a kind of market failure exception, which you can fix by one intervention here or one intervention there, it just isn't viable anymore. Having said that, I am spending some time trying to think about how to put a value on some of these externalities, whether it's natural or digital, because this argument has to be won. I wouldn't say that my views about that are mainstream at all.
Yes, it's interesting because I guess even mainstream, even straightforward cost-benefit analysis surely must have its limits, because well, let's put it this way: if you were going to be entirely kind of, I suppose, if you're purely spreadsheet based, presumably you would spend virtually nothing on arts, for example, and culture, and yet we deem that to be of value. So it seems that nobody is actually, in practice, everyone accepts the fact that you have to sort of measure value in not just purely economic terms. Anyway, I suppose it's a question about how honest people are about that and how far they're willing to go in and go beyond that. But can I just ask you about? Sorry.
You do get all kinds of organisations who come to economists and say, we need to show what our economic impact is. Can you put a pound value on it, please? And it's exactly that, falling into that trap of trying to justify everything in economic efficiency terms. And sometimes you should just say, access to the arts, access to green space is just really important for our well-being. We want some other way of thinking about value. So I like to try to put monetary values on some things, because otherwise policymakers, decision makers think it's zero, and that's a really bad mistake. But there's a balance to be struck with saying there are many dimensions of things that we care about, and it isn't easy to translate all of them into pound terms.
Of course, you're an economist, but you're also an academic. A lot of people say that academic life has been corrupted by this, because universities themselves are having to justify their courses in terms of benefits, financial benefits, and showing their value in that way. Do you feel the pressures to prove the economic value of universities has distorted their mission?
I don't really. I don't feel that. It's an important part of the information that young people should know about when they go to university, and graduates do, on average, earn quite a lot more than non-graduates, and it differs between different subjects. So it's part of the information set. But I would never advise somebody to go to university because they're going to make more money by getting a job in an accountancy firm. And most of my students in the universities I've taught in and visited are not motivated by that, actually. They are motivated by the ideas. So my personal experience, maybe I've been lucky, hasn't been that it's become that instrumental. It's obviously talked about in a very instrumental way in certain circles, and government policy has had that tone. In fact, I would like to see universities become more economics, if you like, in the sense of being more rooted in the cities in which they're located. I taught for some years at the University of Manchester, which was set up to serve the local industries, the textile industry, with science, with the basic R&D for the industry. And I might not be quite so utilitarian about a university now, but I think that civic role and the way that universities really can contribute to their local economy and society if they're engaged with it is actually quite important.
Okay, now we've got a couple more questions coming in. Hold on, Stephen. We'll come to you soon. We're going to start with Melina, and this is interesting because this I think I have to clarify something because earlier on I mentioned it in my question too, that you were saying that the problem wasn't about the ethics; it was about the business model. And Melina Bentes says, "Hello, Professor," she's being very friendly. Isn't it an ethical problem, considering that these companies are very powerful and have chosen to use this power only to manipulate the market and us to their benefit and profit? And she continues, "It's clear to me this is an anti-ethical way to act, and we shouldn't see it as normal, and philosophically seems inappropriate." So the question here is, isn't this really an ethical problem? So maybe you can clarify what you meant when you said the problem wasn't the ethics. When you said it wasn't the ethics, it was a business model. Were you suggesting there wasn't an ethical problem?
Not entirely, no. I think the way the companies lobby to get the regulations changed in their favour is unethical. They're not the only ones that do it. Loads of companies do that. It's become quite standard, and that's an ethics problem for politics as much as for business, I think. What I meant was that you shouldn't imagine that the many thousands of employees of these companies are all bad people. Most of them are like you and me. Nor do I believe that trying to make a profit is unethical, inherently unethical. And that's what generates incomes for people who work for companies. It's what gets invested in innovations and has driven the improvements in longevity and health and the quality of life that we've experienced since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So I don't think wanting to make a profit is inherently unethical either. So there may well be some bad people in companies who want to manipulate the commercial environment in which they're operating by getting the rules changed. But what I was trying to say was that the main you would much more effectively tackle the harmful effects that we see by addressing the advertising-based business model than by sending all of the employees on an ethics course.
Would you therefore say that the business model is unethical, as it were, that it is an inherently unethical business model, or is even that too strong?
Well, I probably think it is, and a lot of economists would probably part company with me there. And this is not a new problem. I'd linked it to Mad Men, but actually Victorian newspapers were full of highly unethical advertising for products that not only didn't work, but were actively harmful. And that kind of pitching of things that do not do the consumer any good probably is unethical in my view. So I'm more comfortable about saying that about the business model than I am saying it about capitalism or wanting to make a profit.
Okay, now we've got a question from Stephen Cowley. Stephen's actually put in 3 separate comments. It's very hard. The problem with printed comments is it's very hard to get tone, but I don't know, he sounds, in inverted commas, a little bit angry that you're advocating censorship on a large scale and whatever happened to Mill on liberty and so forth. And he said public debate is being confined to the ideational limits of young Californian IT graduates, essentially. So, I mean, again, you work at a university. Free speech is very, very important. You must be familiar with this accusation that the people like yourself who express worries about fake news, etc., are in effect stifling free debate, and in particular those views of people that you don't like, particularly on the right.
This is an old debate in philosophy, isn't it, Julian? The can you shout fire in a crowded theatre when there isn't a fire kind of debate. And it seems to me it's actually a cost-benefit question, that freedom of speech is something to be cherished unless it starts to cause large-scale harm. And there seem to me some quite clear examples of where it's causing large-scale harms now. But I don't think there's a clear dividing line. And I am indeed the kind of person I am, so I'll have certain views about it. And this is an area that will always be a contentious frontier of debate in any democratic society. But it's not as if we don't have regulations already against child pornography, against terrorism, unfounded state propaganda. We've seen Ofcom, the broadcast regulator, close down the Chinese state TV channel quite recently. So we already have interventions in what you might call free speech. And nobody's saying, let's throw away free speech. The debate is all about the details of where you can safely draw that line.
Yes, I mean the Mill's harm principle is that the bar is set quite high. Actually, the speech has to actually cause harm demonstrably. That perhaps the vast majority of people would agree was harm before it's appropriate to regulate it, stop it happening. I mean, are you happy with that high bar? Because it seems like some of the things you talk about advertising, for example, as being problematic. I think a lot of people don't really think that advertising causes significant harm, and that therefore to talk about sort of placing limits on that is going beyond certainly Mill's test.
But it's not the content of the advertising that I'm talking about. It's the incentives created by a business model where all of the profit comes from advertising. So I have no views at all about. No, that's an overstatement. My views are not mainly about the content of the advertising. It's about the fact that creates a very strong incentives to do things that get people clicking and clicking and clicking. But I think you can point to examples of clear harm from vaccine denial. Would many people really deny that additional illness and long-term harm to children has been caused by anti-vax MMR campaigns? And you might disagree about 5G conspiracy theories as being the other side of the line. That's a debate to be had. But I think some of these are clearly very harmful.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's just to sort of you're on the spot here. It's very tough to be questioned at huge length, more so online than in the flesh. I think studies that have shown, have they not, that it's more draining to do online for a viewer as well. So we won't keep you much longer, but I just want to go into some of the details of your proposal, which is, we've gone into a lot of the questions to do the argument behind it, which I think is totally appropriate for philosophical forum. But let's just focus a little bit on your proposal itself for this public option, and just deal with a couple of what might seem to be the obvious objections. Now, the expense issue is one that you did address in your talk by pointing out how much we currently pay. I think you said we pay £500 a year to subsidise advertising, essentially, and that your option in a sense would be cheap by comparison. But the point is that we wouldn't stop paying that. would we? I mean, it would be an additional cost because presumably, in fact, with competition from a public option, the advertisers may even have to up their game even more. So it is going to be more expensive, isn't it?
It might be, but not very expensive. I think one could do this at a low per person cost. And there are many things that we think are worth putting public money into, not least the arts, which you mentioned earlier, which are, or higher education, in fact, still gets high public subsidies. So societies make all kinds of choices about what they will spend taxpayers' money on. This would be a small amount. I think the BBC is a very small amount, and compares very favourably with the commercial options, and we have to pay for that too.
I mean, the other objection might be that by choosing the PBC, you're, in a sense, you're cherry picking one of the, some would argue, right, one of the few examples of very successful and in some ways very efficient publicly owned companies. And in fact, the track record of state-run companies, particularly with things which involve a lot of innovation, are very, very poor. I mean, our government couldn't even get a decent track and trace system up and running for a coronavirus, let alone run a huge platform like this. So, what would you say in terms of the objection that this just isn't going to be efficient at the end of the day?
Well, the BBC is not state-run; it's independent, and it has a research and development arm, which has been an incredible innovator in broadcasting and in online technologies also. But it doesn't have to be state-run; it can be state-bought, state-commissioned. And that, I think, would be just as effective if you have a charter, a framework setting out principles of public service, online search or online social media. Then it could be commissioned from any number of different providers, if you like, as long as they interoperate together and abide by the same standards.
Okay, so there are a few comments coming just out of interest. Stephen, who asked a question about free speech, has clarified that his comments were made more in resignation than anger. But thanks anyway. And Melina says thank you for the answer too. Final objection, which is perhaps a moral one. A lot of people will just be very wary about asking the state to take on something else. I mean, was that famous Ronald Reagan line? I don't remember how many words it is. The most terrifying words in the English language being "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Presumably, that actually had some implications of inefficiency too. But do you have any concerns about? Because at the moment you might say benign. We can think in our democracy of a fairly benign government, but isn't it dangerous to give over such an important piece of infrastructure to a government that we can't ever be confident will behave in our best interests in the future?
Well, I wouldn't want to see the government run it, as I just said. I'd want to see it be independent and have some kind of charter and institutional structure of that kind. But the pendulum swings on the role of the government in the economy and society. And since 1979, it's been swinging in the direction of the quotes free market, but certainly not minimizing government spending, because it's not shrunk as a share of the economy, but minimizing certain kinds of government intervention. And I do think it's swinging the other way, as kind of amplified by the way we've seen the government actually step in and run the economy for the past year, tell people what they can and can't do under threat of going to prison if they open their cafes or being fined substantially. So there are challenges that we face, and it's not just digital, it's the impacts of climate change, it's loss of biodiversity, more zoonotic diseases, more flooding, more extreme weather. And the government's going to have to coordinate, at a minimum, coordinate the way that we respond to all of this. We're not going to get a zero carbon transport system or electricity system if the government isn't there using its power to spend money on services, using its power to set standards. So there's inevitably going to be a bigger role for the government, I think, in the years ahead. because of those extremely complex challenges in what have become quite divided and polarized societies. Does that mean the government will run things well? No, absolutely not. There are extreme displays of incompetence all the time, and I hope we'd be able to learn from some of the lessons from when the pendulum last swung pro-government in the post-war decades, and we saw the nationalised industries being run incredibly inefficiently and money being poured into loss-making companies. So let's try and do it a bit better this time. But I think it's one of those cycles that's coming around again.
Yeah. I mean, state-owned and state-run is an important distinction. It's interesting, of course, that when the UK decided to privatise a lot of its railways, what happened in the end was a lot of them were ending up being run by state-owned foreign governments. So here, they were still state-run. It just wasn't the state run by state-owned organisations. It just weren't owned by the British state. They were owned by German and French ones and Dutch ones. Okay. Before we wrap up, the idea is an interesting one. I think it's, and you say you pointed out some of the things we hear more of. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about where this proposal kind of stands. Are people getting behind it at all? Do you have allies in this project yet, or is it too young as an idea to sort of really be able to say with any confidence whether you believe it's got political legs?
I think it's a very quixotic idea, I have to be honest. There's no great groundswell asking for it. The one person I've heard arguing for a public option is Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize winner. And he's obviously lives in the United States, he's an American. So his framing of what that might look like is very different from mine as somebody who lives in the UK and grew up with the BBC. But, he's quite a good person to have on your side. So I hope this discussion will go somewhere. And I certainly hope it will, get the discussion about how to tackle big tech out of the particular kinds of tram lines that it seems to be getting into, because I do think they pose really quite a big public policy challenge that needs addressing.
You provoked me into a follow-up there, because I think your comment about tram lines, I think, is an interesting one. It is true that we somehow get set on certain ways of thinking and don't really even forgetting there are other options. And a lot of people said in the early days of the pandemic that the pandemic shook things up and made us realise that, in fact, our range of options were greater than we think. But it has been a criticism of your discipline, hasn't it? That it has been stuck in its own tram lines for many decades. Do you think that's a fair criticism of economics in its recent history? And if so, are you encouraged that maybe it will be able to escape from those tram lines and follow new interesting directions?
My next book is about exactly this subject. If I can give it a quick trailer, it's called Cogs and Monsters. It's out this autumn from Princeton University Press. I think economics does need to shift out of certain ways of thinking. And, for example, taking the market model as the starting point and making that more complicated, that needs reversing. So you start with the complexity. So it certainly needs to shift. I think it is shifting. There are loads of people who criticize economics, and it seems to me they criticize it for some reasons that were true 30 years ago and are not really true anymore, or for reasons like it uses mathematical models, which is nonsense really, because historians use models, they just don't use algebra, but they could if they wanted to. And in fact, economic historians would put the algebra in for them. But the causes of the Second World War is a model. So I think the critics are wrong, but I think the economics needs to change as well.
Well, thanks so much. I wish I could claim credit for being a brilliant interviewer, knowing that I was queuing up your plug for your new book, but actually had no idea at all. No idea at all, but I'm very glad to hear about it. Cogs and Monsters, you say? Princeton University
Yes.
Press this autumn, or fall,
October.
if you're from the other side of the Atlantic, October. Okay, look, thanks so much indeed. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I think that one of the things I really like about your approach is you're not a waffler. which is really, really good. We've got through a lot of questions and a lot of things, and your answers have always been very carefully expressed and also sort of succinct and clear, and that's wonderful. So thank you very much for that, and thank you
I
for
wish
all
I could
tuning
say
in.
that was about being an economist, but I think many economists are in fact wafflers, so I can't claim that. But
Okay.
And I want to thank again people who've decided this was a good way to spend part of their Friday evening.
Well, that's great. Thanks. Well, of course, the video will be online now, and there will be many more people who are watching this and weren't there actually live on the night. So I hope you've had the opportunity. If you are one of those people, I hope it's recreated that experience for you. Can I just and you can see them at youtube.com and also our page at Facebook is a good way to follow us and see what other events are coming up. Let me just give a few little trails for the last 3 talks in this series. Hae-Suk Kim, from South Korea, is talking about individual freedom in the post-pandemic era next week. After that, we have Sailor Ben Habib, who's asking whether we can still defend the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, a convention that's come up under a lot of criticism in recent years, but also had a lot of people coming to its defence. And finally, on the week after that, Deborah Satz, who is going to be advocating a requirement for national public service. And as someone who grew up in the absence of national service, I find myself thinking, on the one hand, that sounds like a great idea. On the one hand, thinking, I was really glad I didn't have to do national service, so would I be a hypocrite for advocating it? Anyway, all 3 really interesting subjects, great speakers, as has this evening's been. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon.